All right, welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of a review, and we're going to go off on a very different tangent than we normally do. Today, since I haven't read any nonfiction in a long time, any fiction in a long time, we're going to do with a fictional work, and it's going to be A.C. Crispin's The Paradise Snare, the first book in the Han Solo Trilogy. I recently just finished reading it for the third or fourth time. I will have to give the caveat that the last time I read this book, I was probably 16, 17 or so. And the first time I read it I was probably 13 or 14. And I remember loving this book and this trilogy as a kid. I'm in the middle of now, I'm about a quarter of the way through The Hutt Gambit, which is the second book in the series. I have read the series all the way through. Part of why I wanted to read it again was because of the new Solo movie that came out and what an absolute disgrace of a story that was. So I decided I'd give everybody some insight into the trilogy. I don't know if I'm going to do a review of the Hutt Gambit and the final book in the trilogy. I may give a review of the trilogy as a whole, but I'm definitely going to start with at least this book. After a read as an adult, it's still a really good book. In terms of story, this is such a better origin story, so far at least, than anything that Disney has put out so far. The Solo abomination that came out as a movie just pales in comparison to this, and I highly recommend that anyone who saw Solo and was in any way disappointed, read this series. I will say, though, that the writing style is really not geared toward the intellectual adult. Again, I'll give the caveat that I haven't read any fictional works in a very, very long time. I'd say it's probably been at least 15 years since I read a work of true fiction. I do a lot of reading of nonfiction, but I just don't do a whole lot of nonfiction reading. It just doesn't catch my attention at this point in my life. So I have nothing really to compare it to as an adult in terms of fictional writing style and technique. A.C. Crispin is very good at creating the storyline. The storyline's really well done. I'd say its biggest sufferings is twofold. One, she's not as good with dialogue as I would have hoped. Han Solo is someone who, in the original trilogy, and I'm totally disregarding anything other than the original trilogy in terms of content for the character. Han Solo is somebody that spoke in very short sentences. Was very much a minimalist in how he spoke. In this book, now I realize he's a teenager in this book, so things may actually change. He speaks a lot in elongated sentences and almost whole paragraphs at times. And it's just not the Han Solo that we know. Now, this may evolve over the course of the series. So I was a little disappointed in that. And two, I was a little disappointed in the consistency of pacing. So in certain areas, there was too much time spent on one thing. And in certain areas, there just wasn't enough time. It was just blown through. I won't get into too much details, but there's some stuff towards the end that I wish, to be honest, this really needs to be, I think the fact that it was a trilogy may have been forced in some cases. So, in all honesty, there could have been two separate books. There's a planet that Han spends a lot of time on that he gets off of, we'll say, and at the end of the book, there's stuff after that. Honestly, that should either be left to its own book or should be in the next book. So, and I think that stuff should really be expanded upon. Now, I'll also add that there were certain points of pacing and timing that seemed to be a little bit of a contrivance. There was ticking clocks, if you will, that I don't think were necessary. But again, the point is that the story itself, if we were to condense this into, say, a 30-page, this is what's going to happen, really, really well done, really well organized. Everything makes sense. Everything Han does makes sense. Everything that all the other characters do, they make sense in the storyline. So within the self-contained story, it's not like something is done just totally arbitrarily. Everything is explained clearly. Not in great detail necessarily, but clearly. And there are certain aspects to Han's character from the original trilogy that you might have questions about that really this book does a really good job of setting the tone for. In terms of its actual content, since it is a fictional story, I don't want to get too much into it, but I will say that it starts off with Han as a child, and it finishes with him as a teenager, and we are introduced to Han's first love interest. And I like that. I like the fact that Han has a prior love interest to Leia. I'm hoping that throughout the course of the trilogy that the relationship that he develops with this character, and I won't get too much into what the character is and how it's developed in this book, is one that would harden his heart, if you will. One that would make him an abrasive character when it comes to how he deals with someone like Princess Leia in A New Hope. Princess Leia who is as arrogant in some cases as he is. And it would be to some degree a turnoff of Han in that case. The fact that Han is as old as he is and is still single in A New Hope, I would hope that there would be some part of the backstory that explains that. Now, I get it. He's a rogue. That's part of the nature of him being a rogue. But if we're going to have the expose in this trilogy, then let's give good reason for that. So I would say its big detractors, like I said, would be its consistency in pacing, because there are some places where it's too quick and some places where it's too slow. And I would say in its writing style in terms of dialogue, it's not the Han that I would normally expect. And in some cases, there are other parts where there's just too much detail taken care of through dialogue that doesn't need to either be exposed at all or could easily be exposed without dialogue. So that's been my review of A.C. Crispin's The Paradise Snare. Sadly, we can't talk to A.C. Crispin anymore because she has recently passed, relatively recently passed. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. To get any more details on her writing style and her writing technique and where this came from, if I'm going to give it on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give this book a 7. And in terms of storyline and structure, I would say that it's probably a 10 out of 10. You're probably not going to get any better in terms of a fictional writing. In terms of the actual writing technique, it's probably a 5. And that's where my biggest detraction is, although that's partly because the book is technically aimed at young adults. So when I was 16, I was the target audience, and that's probably why I liked it so much. But anyways, that's been my review. I definitely recommend it. I especially recommend it to Star Wars fans who are turned off by really any of the new Disney movies that expand upon the Star Wars universe and just totally trash the previous expanded universe, which included this. So that's been my review of A.C. Crispin's Paradise Snare. This has been Mike, signing off.